big teaching in what I was exposed to was that if you're a person of color, whatever you think about race or racism or anti-racism, you know that you're right. You can't be wrong. Your perspective is something that you should trust and never doubt. And to doubt yourself is to kind of bend the knee to white supremacy. And so don't doubt yourself, don't question yourself, don't undermine yourself. And so it felt like I was betraying myself.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started.
From coast to coast, around the globe, we are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
If you've been doing this work of anti-racism for any period of time, then I want to make the assumption that Marie Beecham is not a stranger to you. This is somebody that you potentially follow on social media, or you tune into her podcast, Know Better, Do Better. She is somebody who has been a great teacher to me. I cannot remember how I stumbled over her podcast quite a few years ago. It was initially the Changemaker podcast, and then now is Know Better, Do Better. And I haven't come across any other podcast where there is so much work that's been done in terms of the research to present the case to you, to us, the listener. And what she has done for me is continually impress me to apply critical thinking, because when it comes to matters of race, there are ways in which we are taught things and we are made to think a certain way. And many times it takes away the ability to think for yourself. And if you look back to probably the beginning of this podcast, I talk about the importance of critical thinking. I did a whole podcast episode on that, and I might link it in the show notes. And it's something that I continually tell my students: don't just take what I'm saying as gospel. Take the time to unpack these concepts and understand it for yourself. Look for the evidence and understand it for yourself. Many times we arrive at this work and we want to, in many ways, be told what to do. What is right? What is wrong? Just tell me what to do and what the right path is, and so that I can take that path and I can be a good person. But the thing with Marie is that she introduces nuance. This work of race, anti-racism, it is so complex, and it isn't just one way. It's not just black and white. There's a lot of gray, and there is merit in living in the gray. And this is a conversation that I have with her today. We could have gone on talking on and on and on, but perhaps what I want to mention is the conversation we had around critiquing the work of Robin DiAngelo, who is the author of White Fragility, as well as recently Nice Racism. You want to hear what she has to say about that and the impact her work has had, particularly on people of color. And so if you're not familiar with Marie, here's a little bit of her bio. She is a powerful speaker, writer, and podcast host. Marie Beecham has taught millions of people how to put anti-racism into practice. Marie is invited to speak at conferences, universities, and industry-leading companies. On any given week, she reaches hundreds of thousands of people online and impacts thousands more through her podcast. Her message stands apart from the rest, offering her thoughtful perspective on race and equity. She's able to bridge divides as she encourages you to do the same. Where polarization is the norm, Marie's approach is nuanced and charitable. When the spirit of the age is outrage and overwhelm, Marie's message is encouraging and actionable. Marie's unique point of view draws people in. It has certainly drawn me in and sends them off better informed, better inspired, and better equipped to make a difference. I will not hold you much longer, people. Here is Marie Beecham. Welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. And today, honestly, is such a special day because I get to have Marie Beecham here with me. Thank you so much for saying yes.
Yes, I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for the invite. I'm excited to talk through some things today.
Now, you are somebody who is so deeply wide read. I believe was it 2024 when you read about 100 books?
I
And
did.
every time I tune into your podcast, it doesn't feel surface or it's not something that you are trying to convince me. It's something that I feel has so much depth to it that I am caused to really apply critical thinking. It's not just something you hear and you're like, oh, that's somebody's perspective. And I
Right.
think it's the nuanced approach with which you bring into this work. And we'll talk about all that, Marie. But I want to just begin by saying, or rather asking, you to just share a little bit about your childhood and growing up. And I know this is something that a lot of your listeners want to know about Marie. We want to know a little bit more about you. And I remember you sharing just briefly about how you grew up mixed race, but you identified as Black, and that was because the spaces that you occupied were, predominantly white. And that just kind of hit me. It dawned on me. I was like, as a Black woman, who has occupied predominantly Black spaces growing up, I would have never looked at it from that perspective. And so for me, it was like, oh, so if you don't identify as fully white, then you're not anything white.
Yeah.
You're seen as, the other race that you represent. So just talk us a little bit about your growing up, Marie.
Yeah, well, you summed it up very well. I also really appreciate your praise and your kind words about um my podcast and the perspective I take in these conversations. And I think that the way I grew up definitely informed the perspective I take now. So yeah, like you said, I grew up half black, half white, but in a city in an area that was predominantly white. Like we were the black family. And so growing up, I never thought of myself as being mixed race or half black. I always was just black. And then I went off to college and I ended up in a group of all black friends, and I have groups that are not that exact same demographic, but it was within that group that I realized for the first time um, that even my identity of being half black is unique. And I think that I have this vantage point of understanding white culture and white people. Half my family is white, many of my loved ones are white. And so, from that vantage point, I have a lot of empathy for white people, and I think I can assume their perspective pretty well. Um, I like to think so. But I noticed that in a lot of the racial justice space, because there is a big difference between being a person of color and being a white person, people of color have a hard time wrapping their mind around what whiteness is. Um, and I think that then it's hard to get that perspective. And then you go to white people about what whiteness is, and then there can just be a lot of, I don't even know how to say it, just like a chasm in terms of how different people see things differently. So I like to think that where I'm positioned of understanding and being in proximity to white people, and then also myself identifying as Black and being well versed in what it means to be a Black person, I think I'm able to see different points of view in the discussions about race, racism, and anti-racism. But also, if you listen to my podcast, you know that it hasn't always been the case that I've been really passionate about nuance and bridging divides. Because in my work before I started the podcast, I really landed hard on in one viewpoint, whatever my convictions were that kind of I stumbled into. I really planted roots there, and I wasn't up for critical thinking. I was more starting with my conclusion in mind and then trying to come up with really compelling reasons why I believed what I already believed. But that's not quite the same as starting with the critical thinking on the front end, being open to the different conclusions it might lead you to. So that was a major shift in my perspective that happened a year or two into really doing this work surrounding race and anti-racism.
Yeah, you share so openly about, how you went viral in 2020. You posted something
Mhm.
about anti-racism, and it just
Mhm.
kind of blew up from there. Could you just talk us a little bit for those who may not know you and how you arrived at this work? Obviously, you were waste-free Marie before then, and,
Man,
environmental
you know your
justice.
stuff.
Yeah, I do. And environmental justice, but then you arrive here in June of 2020, and it's just been a different story from then.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I was waste free Marie on Instagram, and I acquired an interest in environmental justice because I realized how it intersected with racial justice. But for my whole life, I was much more passionate about race than environmentalism. But race felt difficult and dicey and confrontational. So for to take a beat and focus on environmentalism felt like way more approachable and way more palatable, honestly. And yeah, I'd say like an easier route for pursuing justice and good for all people in the world. But even when I was Waste Free Marie on Instagram, I then started posting about race, and my some of my first posts about race went super mega viral, and millions of people saw them, millions of people liked them, and that's when hundreds of thousands of people tuned in to hear what I had to say about race and anti-racism. But as we all know, 2020 was a fraught time for everybody. Um, and so I at that time was dealing with a lot of angst. And though I had a lifetime of personal experience with race and anti-racism, I at that point hadn't studied it deeply. Like you're kind enough to say I'm well read now and I read 100 books last year. That's not always been the case, but that is something that I feel very strongly about because when I got into this work, when people turned to me and were ready to hear what I had to say, I felt like I was grasping at straws to just kind of parrot whatever opinions are popular. I wanted to learn what everyone's saying. Oh, we're saying this about microaggressions. We're saying this about implicit bias. We're saying this about XYZ. And I wanted to spit that out too and like make sure everybody knows the things that everybody knows. But um, a little ways into that, I started reading some books, just hoping to confirm that I'm right about everything, that I happened upon all the right answers. And I was deeply challenged. And it started to pull this loose thread. And I started to doubt my own infallibility, which was a really big deal because at the time, a big teaching in what I was exposed to was that if you're a person of color, whatever you think about race or racism or anti racism, you know that you're right. You can't be wrong. Your perspective is something that you should trust and never doubt. And to doubt yourself is to kind of bend the knee to white supremacy. And so don't doubt yourself, don't question yourself, don't undermine yourself. And so it felt like I was betraying myself to go find out if I'm wrong about anything. But also, it felt like the things that had been instilled in me since I was a very young child, the possibility that you can be incorrect about something, the possibility that you can make a mistake and own up to it. Um, and so that was a real battle, a real struggle. But yeah, a little ways after I got this big platform and everyone turned to me when I was saying a lot of the things about race that are popular and well accepted within the social justice movement, I started to doubt some of the intricacies of those things. And my approach just completely turned on its head because something that was really important to me was that I was right about everything. And once I no longer believed that I was right about everything, um, it was like a domino effect of, oh, I need to start at ground zero, build from the ground up, and really make sure that every conviction that I share is well founded and it's not just a matter of letting what I think others expect me to say shape what I actually have to say.
Mhm.
So it's been a whole journey of learning and unlearning my unlearning.
And I think what makes your work so special and how you do it is because you're willing to be challenged. You're willing to learn. And I think somebody who has that kind of mindset has the ability to go further and this work be sustainable rather than when you're hell bent on this is how it is, this is
Yeah.
the absolute, and you try and convince yourself that that is what it is. And even for myself as a racial equity educator, I found myself going like, well, I don't sound like those educators. I don't sound like, I'm leaving so much room for grace and people to make mistakes, and that it's not that we're saying continue to, offend and do these things, but just allowing grace so that when people do make mistakes, they learn better, they're held, and they can stay in this work. But when somebody messes up and we're just like, rah, 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 this is what you've done. You're on the side of the oppressor and this is who you are. It doesn't leave room for learning. It doesn't,
No.
they feel accused and they don't feel like they can actually be part of this kind of work or this movement. And it just makes it so much harder. And also for me, there's that added complexity of the fact that I am not American. I am not
Mm.
African American. I live in Australia. I'm Australian, and our way of interacting with race and racism is different. Whilst racism, is everywhere in the world, we interact with it differently, and how we are able to have dialogue about this and potentially get somebody to hear you out would be very different than how it's happening, say, in the United States. And so it was important for me to be true to myself, but every time I kind of took to the platform or the stage, I felt like maybe I was letting down the Black community because I
Mm.
didn't come through with that same anger or passion or aggression.
Mhm.
Mine was pretty laid back and come as you are, make mistakes, you will be held,
Yeah.
but this is what you need to know.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that even gets at one of my earliest beliefs that needed to change, which was like exactly what you said. In the beginning, I thought that passion and frustration and a real intensity that you need to know this. And if you don't know this, you are the problem. You are the oppressor. You are putting me in danger. You're putting me in harm's way. Um, I had that belief at first, and I thought it justified bringing any tone to the conversation around race. Um, but even one argument that I was presented with that really challenged me was that, if I need to scream at someone to let them know that they're racist, and I need to be rude and I need to be frankly unkind, that is fine because what they need is the medicine. It doesn't matter if the medicine doesn't taste good going down. Um, But somebody pointed out to me, Marie, that kind of logic doesn't work with anything under the sun. There's absolutely nothing where you say that no matter how I say this, no matter how I speak to you, no matter how I present it, no matter whether I back up my opinion or not, you need to take it because I'm in the right, you're in the wrong. Just the positionality of that justifies whatever route I want to take. That's not uh, how we approach any other subject. We always know that the medium is the message, and the way that we communicate something will absolutely affect how it's going to be received. And especially all of our personal relationships, you could never speak to a friend, deliver a hard truth, and do it with no grace, no kindness, and just expect that they're grateful that you taught them something. That's not how we work. We're soft. We're people. We hurt. We need to hold each other in um, in respect. And so, but even that was antithetical to what I had first learned. I had first learned, do not give them grace. Do not be kind. Do not be gracious. You are actually part of the problem if you do that. You're making excuses for white supremacy. You're prioritizing white people's comfort over the livelihoods of people of color. And so all of those things were really hard for me to wade through and really decide for myself um, if I agreed with a lot of what what other people thought was like the right approach, or if I could form my own convictions about what is most helpful and what is most effective. And I landed on the giving them grace approach too. Um, and like you said, it's not making excuses. It's not hoping that people stay just the way they are. It's actually hoping that people learn and change and grow, but wanting to communicate in the way that's most conducive to that. And a concept that I really love from Dr. King, Martin Luther King, big fan of him over in the States. And he talks so much about how we as the people speaking, we as the messengers are responsible for how that message is received. We have a lot of responsibility over how effective our methods can be. And so he's saying we can't just say whatever we want to say and put the burden on them to hear us clearly. And we can't go about whatever methods, approaches we want to and put the burden on others to make our plans come to fruition or anything like that. He's saying we need to choose an approach, choose language, choose a demeanor, a disposition that makes pursuing racial equality as simple as possible, as helpful as possible, make it effective. And that changed my perspective too, because I had always thought, I'll say it however I want to say it, and the burden is on them to receive it. But I really brought that burden onto myself of, wait a minute, the responsibility lies with me. Or at the very least it's shared. Um, and so, yeah,
Yeah,
that's just another aspect
absolutely.
to all
I'm
of this.
actually currently reading the book King, um,
Mm,
and just getting to hear or read and understand his early life, the things that haven't been published before. And it's been such an engrossing read just to
mm,
see how he formed his perspective on nonviolence and how that just carried through. And that was the medium with which allowed so many other people, white folks, to come across and see actually this is wrong. And I think that approach allowed many people to see the humanity behind it rather than it's them versus us. And so, yeah, a big fan of King too here. And and I'm thinking about the concept of race. And this is
mm,
again something you've shared before and just shared
mm,
so deeply because race is complicated. We know that.
mm,
Because on one hand, it is not real, it's not factual, it's not
mm,
scientific. But yet again, it is very much a social contract, construct, which makes
mm,
it real. Um, and it has and it does, as you share, impact our personhood, right?
mm,
So I'd love you to expand a little bit on that because it's two opposites, but again,
yeah.
they have so much impact and potentially touching on eugenics.
Okay. Okay. Yes. That is a topic I care a lot about because in the beginning, I started by asking all of these questions about racism. And then I had to backpedal to ask a lot of questions about race. That really is, I think, the best starting point. And yes, we've got two lanes in front of us. On the one hand, race is not real at all. And on the other hand, race is very real. Um, and with the whole race is not real at all argument, we are all in unanimous agreement that biologically race is not real. Scientifically, race is not real. Race has no bearing on your capabilities, on anything about who you are. And so that is a baseline assumption in order to not be racist. Because if you believe race is really real and in our genetics, in the way we are, we all come out differently with different capabilities, different strengths, different weaknesses. Then you go down the line of the history of what's called eugenics, which is the belief that biologically we are all intrinsically different based on our race. And eugenics was really terrible throughout history. Um, Eugenics justified a lot of the violence against Jews in World War II, in Nazi Germany. Eugenics also played a big part in justifying enslavement in the United States and segregation, um, for a time. And so the people who have always believed that race is intrinsic into as a part of who we are biologically, it's real. They have always been the most blatantly racist, shamelessly racist people throughout history. And so you want to stay far, far away from eugenics. And in science today, everybody does. There's I have not heard a peep of anyone trying to make the argument that race is real or that we as people are intrinsically different biologically because of our race. But then there is a complicating factor, which is that many people, many racial justice advocates will tell you, just anyone will tell you that in the social sense, race is very real. Um, if race really affects how you're perceived, then it may really affect the opportunities you get. It may really affect the hardships you face. It may really affect a variety of things in your day to day life. And so, in that way, it's effectively real. Um, and so, there's this complicated tension that you have because a lot of people say that we need to pay attention to race and treat race as if it's real because it has real implications. And so they say we should be very conscious of race, or common term is to say we should be very, very color conscious. And the belief is that we must pay attention to race if we want to pay attention to racism. But then on the other side, people are saying, well, no, 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 no. Paying attention to race and believing that it's a really important variable, that it differentiates us, and that those distinctions are legitimate and important, that takes us backwards in time. That line of reasoning, that line of thinking, that race makes us very different, that somewhat slightly resembles the the line of thinking from racist people throughout history. Like that's what eugenicists were saying with a different reason why. Like they had ulterior motives and things like that. But the basic assertion that race makes us very different, they're
Mm.
saying that has been problematic through all of history. So we need to go in the opposite direction by paying less attention to race. We need to believe that race holds less social significance. We need to take the weight out of race. We need to make sure that race never leads us to make any assumptions about who a person is, what they think, what they're capable of. And so those people advocate for being more colorblind, where the less we pay attention to race, the less we allow it to divide us, the better. And you hear from a lot of people, pretty much color consciousness has been on the top of its game for the last 20 years. Ever since the turn of the century, color consciousness has really grown in popularity, and color blindness has been dismissed as sort of racism in disguise. But I do make the case that there is a degree to which we do want both of these things working together in tandem, holding each other in check. I even had this presentation where I explained color consciousness and color blindness, and I said, here's the benefits of color consciousness, and here's where color blindness has some merits too. And the very first thing I heard someone whisper was, I thought she was just going to say you should never be colorblind. I can't believe she's saying that sometimes we should be. And I totally understood where they were coming from. But the reason I say that color blindness has redeeming qualities, before you write me off completely, is that within color conscious progressive circles, when we say we must pay a lot of attention to race and let it inform how we see people, how we treat people, then you can go down this very seemingly progressive road that actually burdens people with facing a lot of racial stereotypes. Um, and so, for example, at that presentation, the person who said that they can't believe that I would consider color blindness, um, they also were talking about how, though they taught computer science, they wanted to do some things about race in their class, but they didn't want to put the students of color through a lesson on race. So they thought they'd send the students of color out of the room um, on those days and then teach the white people, the white students, about race. And in a situation like that, that teacher, with the best of intentions, wanting to teach their students about race, even though it had nothing to do with the subject matter, they they um they were trying to be very, very conscious of race and very, very conscious of color. But in effect, they are making the division, the difference in experience, 10 times what the difference in experience would be between the black students and the white students, or the students of color and the white students.
Yeah.
They're amplifying those differences by sending the students of color outside of the room. They're making it so that your experience is so much more different. And so to that teacher in that situation, I said, no, you could use a dose of color blindness. You should not be creating a situation in which the students of color are subjected to a completely different experience than the white students, even if your goal is to teach the white students how to be anti-racist. So like that kind of example is what I'm referring to when I say that we need a dose of color blindness, meaning we don't want to be so conscious of color that now we're cranking up the social implications of race, that now we're making it so that people of color's experiences are even more different than they naturally would be. Um, and I think something that also supports that idea is just like Ta-Nehisi Coates, a famous thing that he has said is that race, let me not get it wrong, race is the child of racism, not the father. Race is the child of racism, not the father. Um, and it's about what that gets at is that we all unanimously agree that race was invented for purposes of racism. Race was created to justify racist exploitation. There was no concept of race preceding racial oppression. Race came in after the fact, and it was built, it was created, it was invented so that exploitation and justification and oppression could be justified, saying, well, hey, it's not like we're mistreating people who are like us. These people are different from us, inherently different. And they created race to explain those differences. And so, in that same way, when I say we could use a dose of trying to decrease the importance of race, trying to minimize the significance of race, I think that that's the way that we confront and deconstruct what was only ever constructed for purposes of racism. I think it's very possible that we try to diminish the societal importance of race because there are benefits of seeing yourself in people of your race. There are benefits of diversity. There are benefits of these different things. I'm not saying that we pretend like we truly don't see race or that we truly don't take notice of race or that we say nobody can talk about their experience if it has anything to do with race. I'm not talking about silencing or anything like that, but just the larger picture, the larger premise of if race was created for the purpose of dividing, oppressing, and exploiting, then we should question our desire to hold tightly to this invention. And we should at least be curious about how we can engage differently with race. Um, and so, yeah, I went down many, many routes there, but
No, no, no. That was
I hope that answers your question.
that was necessary because it's not a black and white thing. You can't just say this is what it is and it's absolute. Like there's so much, as you say, nuance. And
Mhm,
it's important for us to, especially with the example that you used with the professor, with the teacher,
mhm,
it brings me to something you've spoken about around anti-racist people and how
mhm.
they amplify racism.
Yes,
And I think that
yes.
is something that would be so important to just unpack a little bit because I know
Mhm,
my listeners, they are, predominantly white women in business. They are
mhm,
coaches, they hold space for others, and they're really just trying to understand how can I do better? How can I be a better, space holder? How can I not be racist? How can I amplify my anti-racism? And then the hearing of how they might potentially be amplifying racism is something that would be of great interest to them, Marie.
yes. Yeah, thank you for asking about that. Yeah, so one thing that I care a lot about is how the most well-meaning people might be accidentally doing things that are counterproductive. Um, because I think that makes up, we have a conscientious majority. The majority of people truly mean well and want to do good. But there is something I've observed where the most progressive people, or the people who are most thoughtful about being anti-racist, like you said, end up doing things that are accidentally very, very racist. And so I have a podcast episode about this where I talk through multiple different examples, but I'll start with just like a little anecdote of there are lots of people who follow me and they are teachers. And they talk about, Marie, I want to be anti-racist. I want to be really conscious of color. I want to be very aware that my students of color have other burdens that they're dealing with. They have unique experiences. So then they say something like, in order to account for the fact that my students of color have unique experiences, um, I'm going to be really, really conscious of their race in the classroom. And conscious of their race, as in conscious of how maybe they haven't been as well supported in education, maybe their home life isn't so stable, maybe this, maybe that. And it's all of these race based generalizations that are somewhat understandable. They're somewhat based on fact. The person is trying to be well informed, but when you start saying things like, maybe because this student is Black, they're not as well educated, maybe because this student is Black, this is what their life looks like, and you're trying to be so socially aware, so conscious, you end up doing something that closely resembles the most stereotypical kind of racism. Like, that's racial stereotyping. To start with the fact of someone's race and then draw conclusions, make informed guesses. That's stereotyping point blank, like no question about it. And though you have the best of intentions of being aware of racial disparities and applying that knowledge to a specific situation, it's really, really problematic. And it actually takes us leaps and bounds backwards if every person of color is now dealing with a lot of assumptions and generalizations and stereotypes from white people who mean well. And so, in something that is more specific that has been a phenomenon in the United States for a long time, is there was a researcher, Sydney Hurston Dupree. She wanted to look into whether there's a difference in how, I mean, this is United States, so I don't know how this will translate across the oceans and whatnot, but Democrats and Republicans are conservative, Democrats are progressive. I'm not sure the terms you use in Australia, honestly, but I'm gonna assume that translates. And in this study, she found that Republicans, who are generally thought of as historically of being less racially progressive, is how I'll put that. They spoke very similarly when they were addressing white people or people of color, versus Democrats, the progressive ones. They spoke using high competence language with their fellow white people, but they dumbed down their language when speaking to predominantly Black crowds or people of color. Um, and so that specific study was done by looking back decades over presidential candidates. So that means, okay, when it's pre-planned, when it's deliberate, because there's a whole team of speechwriters, when speechwriters know that a person is going to be speaking to a white crowd or a Black crowd, why are they making the speech different? Clearly, they're making assumptions about the education of Black people or how Black people need to be spoken to. That's really insulting. But why is it only happening with the progressive ones? Why is it only happening from Democrats over decades? But Republicans aren't doing this. So then they took it a step further and wanted to do um, a study where it's not going to be speechwriters. They just wanted to see if this held true with everyday people. And what they found when they had all of these people come in and they'd write a letter to a pen pal. And the only difference was whether that pen pal had a stereotypically white name or a stereotypically Black name. And other than that, they didn't know anything about the person. But when their pen pal had a stereotypically Black name, again, only the very progressive people, only liberals, progressives, Democrats, whatever you want to call it, they were the only group to adjust their speech when they thought that their person they were communicating with was Black. When they thought that the person that they were communicating with was white, they spoke in the exact same way. But when they thought that person was Black, they dumbed down their language. This wasn't true for conservatives or Republicans. This was only true for the progressive, anti-racist, socially conscious people. Now, this is horrendous. It's horrific. But I don't think that it's malicious. I think that it's a product of being taught that race matters a great deal, that racial disparities matter a great deal, and we can look to those racial disparities to make educated guesses about who a person will be. A lot of progressives and anti-racists say when you look at a person, you need to see their race, really consider their race, and think of what their race tells you about them. And so for those progressive people who sat down to write their pen pal, believing their pen pal was a Black person, they considered that person's race. They made assumptions about that person's education level and intelligence, and they acted on those assumptions. I think that whole process is with the best of intentions, but I also think it's textbook racism. And that's why I advocate that we need to question whether it's a good thing that we bring a whole history of racist assumptions and we use that same process that racist people throughout history have always done of relying on race-based generalizations when we see people. But I think that a lot of the calls to be color conscious, what you're essentially doing is saying bring to the table your race-based assumptions, bring to the table your race-based generalizations, and when you see a person and you see their race, respond accordingly, assume accordingly. Um, but that can be so destructive. And I say that with a lot of passion because I strongly believe that anti-racist people and progressive people are so well-meaning. They really want to do no harm. And so I think that it's a fantastic group because they're so responsive to new learning and new information. And that is a message I want to get out far and wide that, oh my goodness, if being color conscious means making racialized assumptions, deferring to race-based stereotypes, then we really need to backtrack and we really need to rebuild from the ground up because that is not forward progress.
Oh, I remember listening to this, that particular podcast, and I was driving and I was like, ooh, like, just getting new information in a way that I hadn't really looked at it. Yes, and here in
Mm-hmm.
Australia, within our political lines, we've
Mm-hmm.
got liberals and we've got conservatives. And it just, it was so it was a concept I hadn't thought about. Yet, the more you spoke, the more it did make sense from experience and all those things, lived experience. And
Mm-hmm.
it was something where I thought that contribution, it absolutely needs to be tabled. We need to look at it from that perspective. But then again, it's still not giving people, white people in particular, answers because white people come into this work with the idea of tell me what to do, Marie. Tell me what to do. Tell me what
Mm-hmm.
is wrong and what is right, and I will just stick to the right path. And it's not that way. It's not clear cut. It requires a lot of thinking, a lot of um understanding. It is just not this is the answer and that's the absolute and that's it. And that's what makes this work really complex and difficult.
Absolutely.
Now,
That's the messy middle for sure. Finding settling in the gray and the just like you said, I found that for so many things related to anti-racism, people want to be told that something is the right thing to do, and that the more and more and more and more and more you do that thing, the better and better and better and better and better things get. But something like color consciousness, I think that's a good thing. But I actually do think that you can take that to be more and more and more and more and more. And now what we're talking about is the world's most progressive person who also is so conscious of color that they're patronizing and condescending and making a whole host of assumptions about me because I'm Black. And then it's like, ooh, wait, actually, let's crank that down. I guess that more fervor in a single direction isn't always the best thing.
yes. And just changing gears a little bit here, Marie.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, you shared a story about going into a
Mm-hmm.
clothing store and being asked to leave.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love you to share that story because I think for people of color and Black people, this is something that we encounter in different ways where you're treated in a certain way and you question, was this person just mean or
Mm-hmm.
are they being racist? And you're just left wondering, is
Yes.
it a race thing? Or is it just
Mm-hmm.
their personality and they were just being mean and they would have done that to somebody else regardless of their race?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I did share about this pretty recently. I went dress shopping and I went into a store, the very first store I went to. Um, and right when I walked in, I was met with an attendant who said that their store was appointment only. And then I asked, well, can I browse the selection to see if I even want to make an appointment? And they said, no, that won't be possible. And I immediately felt like slightly defensive, but I also trusted and understood. And I was like, okay, well, thank you. And they said, but I just want to add, for your sake, I think you probably don't have the budget for our store. Um, Even we have a sale section, but even then, I think that might be above your budget. I just want to give you a heads up. And then I said, thank you very much. And I walked out and I wrote and shared my reflections on that experience because I said it sent me into the familiar game of was that racist or just mean?
Mm,
Um, and I think that a lot of people of color relate to that game. And I think that you could lump it together with the term microaggressions. I have a lot of hesitancies surrounding that term, but I think that that would be what we're talking about right here, which is I don't know that person's intention. I don't know if they meant well. I don't even know if this was about race. But all I know is from my perception, I can't help but wonder. I can't help but suspect. Um, and so I shared how I was processing that situation. My Back in the day when I read all of the big anti-racism books, I was taught that if you suspect that something might be racism, it is racism. Even a book I recently reread, it ended a chapter with the sentence, even if you're wrong, you're still right. Saying that even if you're wrong and it wasn't about racism, you're still right. And it was because you said it was. And that's what I read back in the day that um, made me feel really confident that I can't get any of this wrong. Like, if I say it's about race, it is about race. And so, in a situation like this dress store being turned away, Marie a few years ago would have walked out of there and been certain that it was about race. And that
mm,
even if that person would have vehemently denied, I would say, I know this is about race because I'm a Black woman. Race affects my lived experiences. This is racial power dynamics. You are white. I am Black. Like, it's a tale as old as time. But in recent years, I've really began to question that line of thinking. And it's not that I'm saying that it wasn't about race. In the same way that I won't say that it was definitely about race, I also won't say it definitely wasn't. But
mm,
where I landed was that it's a definitely maybe, and that regardless of whether it was racially motivated or not, I know that it was hurtful, and I know that I'm left wondering. And what I shine a light on in a lot of what I do is that the wondering in itself is a heavy burden to bear.
yeah.
And the second guessing and the thinking and thinking and thinking, was this because of my race? Was this a product of racism? Was this prejudice? Was I victimized or just slightly inconvenienced? Should I be, like indignant? Or should I be really, really like, how do I respond? Um, and I think that a huge thing when it comes to all things that people would refer to as microaggressions is that how we make sense of the situation drastically affects how we're affected. So there have been small instances, I've shared a lot of them on my podcast. I try to really wear my heart on my sleeve and say, there have been times when someone barely stepped on my toe, but I had interpreted that as
Mhm.
they continued a legacy of racial oppression. They brought the whole history of white supremacy with them. I am provoked to thinking about the history of Black oppression. And that small instance really felt representative of centuries of injustice. And when you interpret a small instance as being representative of centuries of injustice, every small instance is unbearable. It is so difficult to deal with, to grapple with. It's so difficult to even reconcile with a person because you're not just trying to figure out how to forgive them for the small thing they did. You feel that you can't forgive them because what they did makes you think of all of these horrible, terrible, unforgivable atrocities that happened in the centuries before our birth. And that it just puts this massive weight on every single interaction and every single relationship in your life. And like I said, I have relationships with a lot of white people. And so for that period of time when that was how I was making sense of every potential offense, it was so destructive for my whole network of relationships because I felt that I couldn't extend trust to anybody. I couldn't give them the benefit of the doubt. I interpreted every single small offense as truly terrible, deeply harmful, and unable something that I was unable to recover from. And I felt really harmed by everything that that offended me. Um, Whereas the perspective that I was sharing with the dress shop experience is that just because I'm not certain that it was racism doesn't mean it's not hurtful. It was very hurtful. It was hard to deal with. It did affect me. Um, and yet, by me not rounding up my certainty, by me not trying to say that I have some special insight on the situation, that I know that person's intentions, by me just living in the gray, I was able to just take the situation for what it was rather than feeling even more even more hurt than was necessary. And I know that's probably sounds like a strange thing to say, but in my experience, so much of microaggressions are where it's a small thing, but it's not a small thing because it reminds you of all these big things. So much of it for me has been really a self-fulfilling prophecy that if I feel harmed, if I make sense of the situation in a way where I assume the worst from the person who did the offending, then I also hurt the worst
Yeah.
versus, a situation where maybe I have a relationship with someone and they slightly offended me. I'm now of the belief that I should give them a chance to express where they're coming from, express their intent. Um, and if they express that it was a race thing or if they express bad intent, that's awful. And that's good to know because that helps me make sense of what just took place. But if
Mm.
they express good intent, that they meant no harm, then I express that I was hurt by it. And we have this back and forth, this healthy rapport. Um, that plays out much, much differently. And so the way that we make sense of the situation will really, really affect how we carry that experience with us. And I found that learning to live in the gray, seek out intentions, take intentions into consideration, all of that. It's not just for the benefit of the person who did the offending. It is largely and maybe primarily for my own benefit of my burdens have become much lighter, much smaller, much more bearable. Um, and I'm able to address each situation for what it is rather than every single time that race comes up, I feel the full weight of history and the full magnitude of every injustice throughout history. That was a really, really difficult way to live. Um, a really, really difficult way to go about relationships. Felt like the stakes were always incredibly high, and my emotions were always just so precarious. My mental state was a roller coaster because it's too much to bear. So
It is. It
I
is.
never. I oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It is a lot to bear. And, I think people who have contributed to this work and shared how we should feel and what this means. And you've had a fair bit to say about Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility and recently Nice Racism. And I'm someone I've read those two books. And I remember even back in 2020, racing to get White Fragility, reading it and feeling seen and affirmed. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's right, and recommending it to my students and my clients and saying, you need to read this. And even when I had other educators and people in this space saying, critiquing her work, it never really I never really took it into much consideration because I felt that this was an inside sort of look into whiteness from a white person. And so getting that perspective is important for me to understand why things are the way they are. until you drop those 3 episodes on Robin D. Link them in the show notes because it just made me look at something that I did not want to look at because I had hailed her in such high regard and not
Mhm.
looked at it from a, again, critical thinking perspective. Some of the
Mhm.
things that you kind of point out was her persuasive writing style and how it drew you in initially with white fragility, right? And then
Yes.
I'm just going to just name a few things, and then maybe you can pick on one and we can just, expand a little bit on that. But her persuasive writing, how she attributes everything to race. And this is something we've been talking about right now in the podcast, saying it's not, everything's not just about race, and if we make it that, it's such a huge burden. Promoting false equivalences that lead to amplified potential harm, and consequently, the division and distance caused due to how she's teaching. You're taking this concept and you're applying it, and it is leaving you feeling a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, your experience with Robin DiAngelo's work is very similar to my experience. I recommended it. I promoted that book. I thought it was really, really powerful when I read it. And but I think I've read it 3 or 4 times now, which is so funny. I'm a big rereader because I'm especially interested by the books that were very formative the first time around. And each time I read it, yeah, I think I'm able to evaluate it uh, more clearly versus the first time I was like, yeah, this is all good, nothing wrong here. But I guess the last thing you pointed out, which is the effect of believing her views on race, with her perspective on race, she believes that race is so defining, it shapes you so much that I think that with her framework, it's nearly impossible to have robust, resilient, healthy relationships between white people and people of color. In my own life, the more I believed what she had to say about how white people are inherently oppressive, how people of color are inherently victimized in every single dynamic, every single situation, every single moment of your day is inherently racialized, and therefore everything is a power dynamic. That was, I mean, I took that, I lived by that for a while, and it was extremely misguided. Um, Even something as simple as like microaggressions are a big thing. It could be something as simple as a white person didn't hold a door for me. That's an experience that everyone deals with. If my white friend had that same experience, the door wasn't held open for them, they'd be like, oh, bummer. And then they'd go and they'd open the door. But for me, under Robin DiAngelo's tutelage, I shouldn't just go, ah, bummer, and then open the door. I should see that as absolutely, definitely racialized, whether the white person realized it or not. And I should not only be bummed that the door wasn't held for me, but I should interpret that as my dignity was stripped from me, my humanity was denied. Like all of these things, I felt all of that. I felt deeply at everything. But even in that situation, I'm relying on assumptions. I'm definitely assuming the worst. And I'm as harmed as a person could be from something as small as the door not being held. Now, sometimes the door not being held open for you is enough to ruin your day. And sometimes it might be because of race or a number of other factors. And so I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but under that framework, that kind of teaching, she just endorses such a certainty that I don't think is healthy. Um, and she kind of has this circular reasoning in her view, um, which she tells people of color that whatever you believe or suspect in a situation, you are absolutely right about that. And if a white person doubts you or tells you that their intentions were good or tells you anything else, um, that's just them revealing their white fragility and their white supremacy. And all they're doing is proving you right. They do think they're superior. They do think you're inferior. And I mean, it's really persuasive and compelling, but it is a circular argument when the where the end result is whatever you initially suspect, you're correct. And there's actually no way you can be wrong here. And even if someone tells you you're wrong, you're still right. And with all of this, and I know we're getting close to time, but I'll go over a little bit if you still want to finish up the conversation. I with all of this, even as I say, I don't know who's listening, and I'm sure that they don't know my life story, my experiences, whatever. I'm always so concerned that I come across as insensitive or minimizing or things like that. That is not where I'm coming from at all. I'm coming as an insider who has lived it. And that's why I care about critiquing Robin DiAngelo. It's not because I'm the person who just loves to say, and these people are wrong and they're making a big deal of this and blah, 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 blah. That's not my perspective at all. My perspective and my experience is that I lived by every letter that she wrote, and I lived as if she was completely right, and it ran me into the ground. It was the the most awful perspective to believe as a person of color because it maximized my burdens, and it made me feel as though I couldn't be at ease in the presence of white people, and I couldn't trust white people. And it also made a lot of white people feel that they were nothing more than a liability to me. For white people who believed that they can only cause harm, and that if they really, really work hard, then they can minimize their harm, that they can never truly do good, they can never truly be safe, um, and that at the very best, we'll just be in this constant dance of offense and apology, offense and apology, offense and apology, because every single situation is racialized and all of that. Gosh, it was the lowest point in my life probably, and that's why I care about critiquing this point of view. It's not to slam someone, it's not to, I don't know, drum up controversy. It's to reveal what I think is a better path. And it's because I feel so strongly that we do need to set a new and better precedent when it comes to conversations surrounding race and anti-racism. And it relates to what you were saying earlier about maybe that precedent needs to involve some grace. It needs to involve more nuance. It needs to involve a lot more leeway and a lot more trust and mutual respect, mutual accountability. Um, because yeah, but I'm honestly really curious with I want to hear your perspective as you've come to think differently about Robin DiAngelo, kind of where you were before. I know you said the things I said really turned some gears for you, but I'd love to hear about that.
Thank you for asking. The thing with Robin DiAngelo, I again, it's how you framed it. It's a persuasive writing. I had never looked at it from that perspective. At the point at which we were learning, there was such a heightened desire to know that this was wrong and everything that had happened to lead up to that. There was just this black, white, this is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
this is right, and this is the path. And so what I was consuming, and particularly that book, it felt like gospel. It felt like this was the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason why I was able to like listen to what you had to say is because throughout the history of listening to, the Changemaker podcast, which is now, Know Better, Do Better, um, trust was developed. Like I knew
Mm-hmm.
not just here just to critique for the hell of it or just to bash her or bring her down. There
Yeah.
was there was there was substance to it. And that's why I listened and listened again. And I did feel the weightiness. I did feel like I was operating with that lens of, oh, they've done that. That's a race thing. That's a race thing. Like, I'm getting ready to go face the world. I know I will be, the only person,
Right.
the only black person. And you kind of put this armor on and you don't even know that you have it because you're approaching
Mm-hmm.
everything from a race lens.
Mm-hmm.
And just hearing you say that and just going like, wow, she's describing exactly how I feel and how the impact has been without even me knowing it or realizing it. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, I feel like I'm still digesting it. I feel like I'm still taking it all in. It's something that I've recommended to my students and gone like, we need to have this perspective. We need to hear this whiteness. And so it's going to take me some time to then now be able to once the critical thinking has kind of really I've sat with it to then present this to my clients and my students, from a different perspective, that nuanced perspective, And the thing is, you're not disagreeing with everything she's ever written.
No,
Things
no, no,
that
no,
are
no.
warranted, they're things that are true, they're things that are right.
Yeah.
But there are also other things that are really, really wrong and
Yes.
have been harmful, as you've shared and as I've shared.
Yeah.
So I just love the perspective that you brought in. And
Mm,
it was through that building of trust that allowed me to even hear out this argument,
mm,
whereby if this was one of the first few episodes, I think it would just gone over me and gone like, oh, here we go
mm,
again.
mm.
I have found this book to be useful. I'm just gonna kind of
Yeah.
skip through, but I really did listen, and I'm gonna put those episodes in the show notes so people can go directly and listen and just for themselves to create that own thinking for themselves. Because what I try to tell my students and even myself is don't just take it for what it is. Don't just take what I'm saying to be gospel. Ask, dig, research, find out for yourself. And don't let this be something that you're saying and just regurgitating what I've said or what Marie has said. Do a little bit more digging. That's where
Yeah.
reading widely really, really helps.
Like,
Reading
yeah.
and getting different perspectives allows you to really see things from a very different perspective and dimension.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, it's I to hear your journey, your wrestle, your I don't know, and I'm still coming around to this. I'm still sorting this out. Um, that is so so relatable. I think I've hit so many of those inflection points in my own journey, where I don't quite know how to steer straight on the money. It's more like I like veer left, veer right, veer left, veer right, and like I feel like I'm zeroing in on my different convictions, and so I want to applaud you for struggling through the tension and the turmoil of considering a perspective that is challenging because it strikes at such a personal chord. There was a time in your life when those books from Robin DiAngelo struck you as a lifeline, like they put words to something. They were a refuge, they were balm, they felt healing. And so to consider how they might be flawed, to let that little thread be pulled loose, it's not easy and it's not a purely intellectual endeavor, though we like to think it is. There's emotions wrapped up in that. And there's emotions of who would I be if I didn't believe all of this? Who does that make me? Where does that put me? If, the holy grail of progressive anti-racism doesn't perfectly align with what I'm trying to say, and it's hard to come to terms with
Yeah.
all of that. But just like you said, I do not dismiss every single word Robin DiAngelo's written. There, like I said, I read books over and over, and I'm always mining for gold, for nuggets of truth. I'm always trying to remind myself of so many of the good and helpful points that are made in just about every book I pick up, and so that even when I do have criticism to offer, I can completely understand that they're coming from the best of intentions, that they're earnestly trying to seek the right answers and share them with people. And yeah, they're trying to make it persuasive and compelling. And I just want to see through that. I want to see it all for what it is. And I want to be able to honestly sift the good from the bad. But yeah, something I never want to be confused is it's not that when I say that these things about microaggressions or how to make sense of things or all of that, it's not that I'm saying that racism isn't grave, isn't serious, isn't all that bad. No, I absolutely think that racism is a huge issue. And that's why I devote all hours of my day to learning, researching, sharing, all of that. We need to be as effective as possible in facing and combating racism. But the thing that I'm especially concerned that we're overlooking is just how fear of racism also presents burdens in and of itself. Like the story of me in the dress store and getting turned away. There's a degree to which, if racism was involved in that situation, then oh my goodness, we need to do things that our society does not produce people who are racially prejudiced. Like racism is first and foremost an issue there. But also, in the event that that situation had nothing to do with race, in the event that that warning, we don't think you can afford anything here, is truly something that they say to everyone, then all that I was left with that day was my own vigilance, my own fear of racism. And even that is something that's so difficult for people of color to live with. And I think that teachings like Robin DiAngelo's or other anti-racism voices and teachers and leaders, I think that they do a great job of trying to end racism. But my fear is that even if we lived out all of their directives perfectly and we create the world that they envision, where there's no more racism, if we're all living by a lot of the things they're saying, I think we'll end up overestimating racism to the point where even when racism is no more, or even in a situation where racism is absent, we're still going to have people of color and Black people, especially, who are burdened by fear, burdened by vigilance. And those burdens are nothing small. Racial stress weathers you, it wears you, and it's a real issue. So I never mean to minimize racism by saying, like, oh, yeah, we don't need to worry about racism. Instead, let's focus on what the progressives are doing wrong. No, no, no. It's because I care about ending racism, fighting racism, that I'm deeply concerned that we are only opting for the most effective approaches, the most effective strategies, the most useful and helpful ideas. And that's why we need to have a really high bar, a really high standard of excellence. And we want to also make sure that as we deal with racism, we aren't fanning the flames of fear in the process, but we have the just like our analysis is just right, that we're not seeing racism where it isn't and leading to fear where we don't need fear, but also that we are aware enough to see racism where it is and that we can properly deal with it. So I think it's a both and situation, but I see fear of racism and racism itself as these dual threats. And I want to do away with all the things that threaten the well-being of people of color and Black people, and just the whole dynamic of what does it mean to live in a flourishing society that is united, unified, and equal.
And Marie, I think that is such a beautiful place to leave this conversation. I will ask one last question, and it's one question that I ask all my guests. And I wonder, if fear wasn't a factor, how do you think you would show up in your work?
Wow, I love that question. Um, wow, if fear wasn't a factor, I think that I think that there'd be a lot less apologizing probably in my work, and there would be a lot more sincere and earnest delivery of what I think is true and valuable and important. And I wouldn't feel the need to offer so much buffer, so much apology, so much I'm sorry, so much um, basically covering all of my bases to make sure that no feathers have been ruffled. For me, when I say fear, I think fear is so much fear of being misunderstood, misconstrued, um, fear of being dismissed or persecuted in some way. And so, on the one hand, I spend my time and my work delivering ideas and information that I think is really important. And then the other half of what I do is saying, well, I'm sorry, and I hope you don't mind, and I hope you're not upset with me, and I hope you this. And, it's like all of the like, oh, please don't be mad. Oh, please just hear me out. Oh, please, oh, please. And I think if fear weren't a factor, I wouldn't be stuck doing all of the apologetic stuff, and I'd be able to just really hone in and focus on the things that are of most importance. I wouldn't have that distraction going on. So
Mm.
maybe I should get going on that. Maybe fear shouldn't be a factor.
But yeah, and I love how you've answered that because I'm nodding on so many things, the being misunderstood, the not ruffling feathers, that wanting people to get what you're saying, and you're not trying to be this or the other. It's a tough one, especially given the complexity of race and just how it makes all of us feel. This is an area where fear will always, I feel, be there. And this is not the fear of safety. That's different. The fear where you're like, I know I can't do that. This is for my safety. But I'm talking about just the fear that just keeps you from ever moving. That's the kind of fear that I'm talking about. And I love how you share that because I can relate to that so much. Marie, where can people find you? Where is the best way that people can connect with you? And please do share about your Patreon as well.
Ah, yes. People can find me at Marie Beach on Instagram. Um, the Know Better, Do Better podcast, that is my pride and joy. And I know we'll have a few of those episodes linked in the show notes. That's really where my whole life story and my ideas in their fullest form are available. And where you can support me is my Patreon. Patreon is a monthly subscription. You can find me there at Marie Beecham. And that's where I share my ideas when they're in their earliest form. That's where I share things in their rawest form. And if you sign up for that, you get a article essentially sent to your inbox week after week, every single Friday. And that's a great way to get in the inner circle if you're interested in supporting.
Wonderful. Marie Beecham, thank you so much for your time. You have shared so generously, and I am just so grateful that we've had this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented from coast to coast.